Sure. So the Wednesdays are okay with
We will call the Subcommittee on Communications and Technology to order, and by unanimous consent, Ms. Eshoo and I would like to ask our colleagues to waive opening statements so that we can actually resume this hearing or have the new hearing of the resumption of the hearing going forward. And I would suggest that if the panel members who had the opportunity to give your opening statements before, if you want to share a few comments, that would be fine. But if you want to kind of move through them rapidly, that would be fine. I tell you all that because they just called votes on the House floor. So, best laid plans. So without, yeah, it'll be 7 votes. And I understand you all have agreed to waive statements, so thank you. So, no, we could just pass bills and get everything done this morning at this rate. So with that, thank you for returning. As you know, this is a resumption of the hearing on ownership, and so with that, I guess we go right into Q&A then, right? So let me start with a question to Mr. Waldron. Tax incentives are generally considered a relatively efficient way for the government to encourage certain policies. The minority tax certificate is a voluntary instrument that entities can take advantage of or not, depending on whether the situation is appropriate. Do you think the FCC would be able to structure a program around a minority tax certificate that would prevent arbitrage? And then I'd like to get the views of the other panel members as well. So, Mr. Waldron, what do you think of that?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yes. NAB
and please turn on that microphone.
Yeah. NAB has long supported tax certificates, and we think they can be structured in a fair and balanced way. I do want to emphasize the tax certificates did exist, and there were more than 50 tax certificates that were done. And so we think it can be structured, and it's, as you point out, it is a voluntary program, really a market-based program to incentivize minorities to get into the business. So we think it's an excellent idea and a step that the Commission and the Congress should take.
Mr. Chairman, NAA has supported the tax certificate and some other proposals that the MMTC has put forward to increase diversity of ownership. So we think it can be done, and we hope Congress would enact it.
Ms. Keenan?
Hello.
Good morning.
President and CEO of MMTC, Multicultural Media, Telecom, and Internet Council. I absolutely concur with what has been said. MMTC has long been in the forefront of pushing for these tax certificates. They're the right way to handle this at the right time. If you were to do a bar graph of what it looks like when you have tax certificates and when you don't, this is what it looks like when you don't. Imagine the bottom. But when you have it, this is what it looked like. If you were to go back, you'd see that the highest period of growth and ownership by women and people of color was under the tax certificate program, and those were bona fide people who entered at that level. But once that program was taken away, we are back at those levels that were negative. So absolutely, this is the right way, and it's the right time.
Mr. Scarrato?
Yes, at the National Hispanic Media Coalition, we support the idea of reinstating the minority tax certificate. Moreover, we would hope that Congress could reinstate it in a way that is race conscious as the prior tax certificate was. We think that would have the most impact on ownership diversity.
Okay. Mr. O'Boyle?
Common Cause also supports the reinstatement of the minority tax certificate program. I think this is a consensus position, not only because increasing diverse ownership is an important public interest goal, but because we believe the evidence shows that female and diverse ownership drives more and better representative content of female and minority populations, and that there's a problem with misogynistic and racist characterizations in the media because there's such a limited ownership of the media by females and minorities.
Got it. Mr. Kent?
Hi, my name is Jason Kent, as CEO of Digital Content Next, and kind of representing the future of digital media. You know, any issue around promoting the voice of minorities is a paramount importance to us, and the details on that I'd like to follow up with you. That'd be all right.
All right. Thank you. I'm going to yield back the balance of my time so we can get to Ms. Eshoo for her questions as well, and to Mr. Latta.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, I'd like to ask for unanimous consent to place 2 pieces in the
without objection.
in the record. Thank you. Do I need to name them? No. Okay. Save that time. All right. Thank you to all the witnesses, and I want to thank the chairman for agreeing to reschedule the rest of this hearing. I thought that it was important, and I thank him for agreeing and doing so. To Mr. O'Boyle, can you tell me how many shared services agreements, the SSAs and joint sales agreements still remain in place today? And does the commission require broadcasters to disclose the existence of such agreements?
Thank you for the question. Determining the precise number of these arrangements is surprisingly difficult. Credit to Free Press for doing some good research to try and infer by looking through SEC filings the exact number, but it should not be this hard. The FCC's Form 323 is a problematic reporting tool. It's complex and cumbersome, and noncompliance is also an issue. So there are issues with the reporting tool itself, but more broadly, to take another issue, the 2014 JSA reform order, which Common Cause supported, did not actually require broadcasters to disclose SSAs. So we feel the most direct and easiest way for us to get a handle on a census, the number of arrangements out there, is to require they be disclosed. And I would offer that this bespeaks the bigger problem that we need better data, and that regardless of where panelists...
Sounds like it's an area that really needs some work.
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, from what you've said. To Mr. Scarato, how do you respond to those that suggest that the JSAs and the SSAs actually increase broadcast ownership diversity?
Thank you for the
And I
question.
appreciate the comments, responses to the chairman's question a moment ago. That was terrific.
Yeah, so looking at the available data, we don't actually think that the advent and rise of these types of sharing arrangements do anything to help support greater ownership diversity. In fact, if you look at the data, these agreements have really come to prominence over the last 10 years or so, going from about 37 agreements.
What do you think, shorthand, they actually produce?
Well, what they do is they allow current owners in the market to circumvent media ownership rules and own more, and that's at the expense of opportunities for people of color and women that may want to enter the market.
Wow. Thank you. To Mr. O'Boyle, I know that you know that there have been efforts from this side of the aisle led by Mr. Yarmouth earlier this year in introducing legislation to require the disclosure of the true sponsors of political ads on the public airwaves. We have a huge problem in our country, obviously, especially on the heels of Citizens United. Now, in the absence of any newly enacted law, which obviously is not going to take place, I mean, because there's opposition from our friends on the other side of the aisle. What do you think the FCC can do? What steps do you think they should take?
Well, right away...
in terms of disclosure relative to the airwaves?
Yes. Well, Section 317 of the Telecommunications Act empowers the FCC to write sponsorship identification rules. That is, to write rules requiring the disclosure of the, quote, true identity of an ad sponsor. And the FCC, in interpreting its own authority decades ago, said that the name of the sponsoring committee was...
How long ago was that?
I can get the exact year, but I believe it was in the 70s. At the time, that may have sufficed.
Almost a half a century ago.
But times and circumstances have
I think
changed.
so.
And in the post-Citizens United world, we have unprecedented amounts of unaccountable spending. Voters don't know who is trying to persuade them.
Well, that's the problem. I just, what would you recommend
I would
they
recommend
do?
that the FCC undertake a notice of proposed rulemaking to begin to rewrite its sponsorship identification rules, updating them for the...
So an update of that section.
That's right. And we could do that in time for the 2016 general election.
I'll yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields
Thank
back
you.
time, and we now go to Mr. Latta.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Waldron, in your testimony, you noted that the FCC has not completed its statutory mandated quadrennial review of ownership rules in a timely manner. Can you explain how the FCC's failure to complete its quadrennial review affects the ability of broadcasters to effectively compete in the marketplace and why it's important to get this done?
Thank you, Mr. Latta. It's been more than 12 years since the FCC actually has given a
Is your
thorough
mic on?
look at ownership.
Yeah.
It's been more than 12 years since the FCC has given a thorough look at ownership. Think about how the landscape has changed in that time. We have Facebook and Google are a significant source of competing ad space for local broadcasters. We have cable companies that have formed interconnected packs, so they compete against broadcasters for advertising, for audience and eyeballs. And in that environment, we still have an ownership rule which exists as if a broadcaster only competes with broadcasters. It does not acknowledge that your local car company can go place an ad on Facebook, or they can place an ad with Google, or they can place an ad with other broadcasters, or they can place an ad with every cable company. And so what we think, if the FCC actually did the job that Congress gave it to look at its ownership rules and look at the current environment today, we think that they would actually come up with a sensible rule that would allow reasonable combinations of TV stations. But looking at the prism through 2003 distorts what the rules should be.
Well, thank you. Mr. Chairman, if I could, I think I'm going to yield so maybe the gentleman from New Jersey can get his questions in. Thank you.
I recognize the gentleman from New Jersey.
Thank you. Mr. Chair, I just wanted to follow up to some extent on what Ms. Eshu was asking, because the broadcasting industry, particularly TV stations, have benefited greatly from billions of dollars in revenue from political advertising every cycle. And although the FCC took a step forward by putting the public and political file online for TV stations, I'm concerned there isn't enough for consumers. Are consumers able to easily use these online political files to determine who is behind the issue ads that they see? And, don't Americans have the right to know who's behind these ads? You comment on, the access to finding out the information about who's doing these ads. I was going to ask Mr. O'Boyle, yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Pallone. We feel that there are important steps the FCC could take to improve the quality of the online public file by making it a searchable, queryable database that, as other government agencies make their data machine readable so that you can search.
Well, you agree that right now it's hard to find.
It's not useful. It's not particularly useful. In many cases, we have public files that have been handwritten, scanned into a PDF and uploaded so that they can't actually be searched, and you have to decipher sort of a scrawl, and that could be made much more usable. More broadly speaking, even if that were made as usable as we would like, it still would not disclose the true identity of an actual sponsor of an ad. And to your question about whether voters are able to determine who's trying to persuade them, no. To get that, we need the FCC to undertake a rulemaking, updating its sponsorship identification rules for 2015.
Okay. I had one more question. Do we have time?
We've let the cloakroom know that we're trying to finish.
All right, then let me stop. Thanks.
Well, ask it.
Well, no,
Oh, all right, all
Ask
right.
it.
Well, this is a New Jersey question, though.
Oh, forget that.
Shut off your
I can
mic.
wait till we come back.
No, we're not coming back.
Oh, all right. Well, I'm just worried that in New Jersey, this is from Hurricane Sandy and the local broadcasters. In New Jersey, we already have too few TV stations, and one of those is owned by an entity that already owns two other stations in the same market. So I was going to ask either Mr. O'Boyle or Mr. Scarrato, can you elaborate on whether joint ownership, as well as situations where there are sharing agreements between stations, produces more local news and information for consumers? This is our concern in New Jersey.
Briefly, and I'll allow Mr. Scarrato to respond as well. The University of Delaware, Professor Daniel Yanich has studied extensively the nature of ownership structure, nested ownership structures, and the impact they have on content. And in every market they've studied, they yield homogenization of content. So rather than plowing the efficiencies into new investigative local reporting that holds local officials accountable and informs local electorate, instead they're padding the bottom line.
Okay. And further, I would just add that, there is evidence that as these agreements are entered into, the sharing agreements, that newsrooms shrink and there are fewer jobs at these stations. And so that has a pretty direct impact on the quality of local news and information.
I think you're right. All right. Thank you very much.
We want to thank our panelists. We have 7 votes, so the intent would be to adjourn unless there's objection. Getting mixed signals.
I think, I wish we could stay all morning because there's so much that we can be discussing.
Right.
But, you know, all the well-laid plans in the world. I don't see any other members that showed up from our side for the hearing. So do you anticipate any? Because, I mean, if you don't, then
I don't believe so.
Then
So I think
I
other
think
questions
that,
can be submitted for
yeah.
the record. Otherwise, you're going to be here another hour.
I have some
before
more
we get
questions,
back,
so I'm going to submit them to
yeah.
you. All
All
right.
right.
We
Thank
wanna
you for your
thank you.
participation.
Yeah.
Sorry, this
Thank you
hearing was
very much.
abbreviated as well.
Thank you.
We appreciate your input, and maybe we can have a further discussion on these issues down the road. We're adjourned.
Thank you.
All right.
Took longer to